national television? No. He delighted in it. He reveled in it. He exulted in it. He could not understand why the people around him did not share his delight. And then a long period of silence ensued while the mob beat the daylights out of police officers and invaded this building, as you saw on security footage, and proceeded to hunt down Vice President Mike Pence as a traitor and denounced and cursed Speaker Pelosi, both of whom you heard mob members say they wanted to kill. They were both in real danger. And our government could have been thrown into absolute turmoil without the heroism of our officers and the bravery and courage of a lot of people in this room. Here's what Republican Representative Anthony Gonzalez of Ohio said. He's a former pro football player. We are imploring the president to help, to stand up, to help defend the United States Capitol and the United States Congress, which is under attack. We are begging, essentially, and he was nowhere to be found. Nowhere to be found. And as I've emphasized this morning, that dereliction of duty, that desertion of duty was central to his incitement of insurrection and inextricable from it. Inextricable. Bound together. It reveals his state of mind that day, what he was thinking as he provoked the mob to violence and further violence. It shows how he perpetuated his continuing offense on January 6th, his course of conduct charged in the article of impeachment as he further incited the mob during the attack, aiming it at Vice President Mike Pence himself, while failing to quell it in either of his roles as Commander-in-Chief or his real role that day, Inciter-in-Chief. And it powerfully demonstrates that the ex-president knew, of course, that violence was foreseeable, that it was predictable and predicted. That day, since he was not surprised and not horrified, no, he was delighted. And through his acts of omission and commission that day, he abused his office by siding with the insurrectionists at almost every point, rather than with the Congress of the United States, rather than with the Constitution. In just a moment, my colleague, Mr. Cicilline, will address President Trump's conduct, his actions and inactions, his culpable state of mind during the attack, as he will establish yesterday's explosive revelations about House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy's desperate call to Trump and Trump's truly astounding reaction confirm that Trump was doing nothing to help the people in this room or this building. It's now clear beyond doubt that Trump supported the actions of the mob, and so he must be convicted. It's that simple. When he took the stage on January 6th, he knew exactly how combustible the situation was. He knew there were many people in the crowd who were ready to jump into action, to engage in violence at any signal that he needed them to fight like hell to stop the steal. And that's exactly what he told them to do. Then he aimed them straight here, right down Pennsylvania at the Capitol, where he told them that the steal was occurring, that is, the counting of the Electoral College votes. And we all know what happened next. They attacked this building. They disrupted the peaceful transfer of power. They injured and killed people, convinced that they were acting on his instructions and with his approval and protection. And while that happened, he further incited them while failing to defend us. If that's not ground for conviction, if that's not a high crime and misdemeanor against the Republic in the United States of America, then nothing is. President Trump must be convicted for the safety and security of our democracy and our people. Mr. Cicilline.
Mr. President, distinguished senators, as we've demonstrated, there is overwhelming evidence that President Trump incited the violence and knew violence was foreseeable on January 6th. He knew that many in the crowd were posed for violence at his urging. And in fact, many in the sea of thousands in the crowd were wearing body armor and helmets and holding sticks and flagpoles. And then he not only provoked that very same crowd, but aimed them at the Capitol. He literally pointed at this building, at us, during his speech. He pointed to the building where Congress was going to certify the election results and where he knew the vice president himself was presiding over the process. Now, no one is suggesting that President Trump intended every detail of what happened on January 6th. But when he directed the sea of thousands before him, who were reportedly ready to engage in real violence, when he told that crowd to fight like hell, he incited violence targeted at the Capitol, and he most certainly foresaw it. My colleague, Manager Dean, will stand up after me and walk you through the overwhelming evidence that supports those claims. I want to start, though, by talking about what happened after that. There was a lot of discussion yesterday about what the president knew and when he knew it. There are certain things that we do not know about what the president did that day, because the president, that is former President Trump, has remained silent about what he was doing during one of the bloodiest attacks on our Capitol since 1812. Despite a full and fair opportunity to come forward, he's refused to come and tell his story. As Manager Raskin said, we would all do that. In fact, I would insist on it. If I were accused of a grave and serious crime that I was innocent of, I would demand the right to tell my side of the story. President Trump declined. But there are certain facts that are undisputed, that we know to be true despite the president's refusal to testify, which his counsel either ignored entirely or didn't and couldn't dispute. Before I go to those facts, let me quickly just touch on a few things. First, President Trump and his counsel have resorted to arguments that the evidence presented was somehow manufactured or hidden from them. And I want to be very clear about this because this is important. In terms of the timing of when they received materials here, defense counsel had access to all materials when they were entitled to have them under Senate Resolution 47. And they cannot and have not alleged otherwise. As to their desperate claim that evidence was somehow manufactured, they have not alleged that one tweet from their client was actually inaccurate, nor can they. We got these tweets, which are, of course, statements from the former president, from a public archive, and they are all correct. You also know the president's claims about evidence being manipulated also are untrue because they didn't even object to the introduction of the evidence when they had the opportunity to do so. So I hope we can now set those issues aside and turn to the facts of this case and really set the record straight about the undisputed facts in this case, about what the president knew that day and when he knew it. And at the outset, let me say this. As you may recall, in direct response to a question yesterday, President Trump's counsel stated, and I quote, "At no point was the president informed the vice president was in any danger," end quote. As we walk through these undisputed facts, you will see quite clearly that is simply not true. As you can see here, from just after 12 p.m. to just before 2 p.m., President Trump delivered his statements at the rally, which incited an initial wave of riot protesters coming down to the Capitol. And his speech was still ongoing, and you saw the evidence of people broadcasting that on their phones. He finished his speech at about 1:11 p.m., at which point a much larger wave surged toward us here at the Capitol, ripping down scaffolding and triggering calls for law enforcement assistance. 30 minutes later, at 1:49 p.m., as the violence intensified, President Trump tweeted a video of his remarks at the rally with the caption, quote, "Our country has had enough. We will not take it anymore, and that's what this is all about," end quote. During the half hour following that tweet, the situation here drastically deteriorated. Insurrectionists breached the Capitol barriers, then its steps, then the complex itself. By 2:12, the insurrectionist mob had overwhelmed the police and started their violent attack on the Capitol. And as you all know, this attack occurred and played out on live television. Every major network was showing it. We've shown you during the course of this trial, side by side, exactly what the president would have seen on TV or his Twitter account. We've also shown you that he would have seen around 2:12 p.m. images of Vice President Pence being rushed off the Senate floor. Now, I won't replay all of that, for you, but for timing purposes, here's the footage reacting to Vice President Pence leaving the floor.
No audio.
for
They
the Senate
just cut out.
floor.
Looks like they and sometimes
It
the
seemed
Senate
like they just ushered
controls
Mike
it.
Pence out really quickly.
Yes, they did. That's exactly what just happened there.
And
They ushered Mike Pence out. They moved him fast. I saw the motions too.
Defense counsel seems to suggest that somehow the President of the United States was not aware of this. The President had no idea that his Vice President had been evacuated from the Senate floor for his safety because violent rioters had broken into the Capitol with thousands more coming, and with the Capitol Police completely overwhelmed. This was on live television. So defense counsel is suggesting that the President of the United States knew less about this than the American people. This is just not possible. That the Secret Service failed to mention that his vice president was being rushed from the Senate for his own protection. That nobody in the White House thought to alert him. That none of our law enforcement agencies raised a concern to the commander-in-chief that the vice president was being evacuated from the Senate floor as a violent mob assaulted the Capitol. That simply cannot be. And with each passing minute on the timeline of events on January 6th, it grows more and more inconceivable. Let's continue forward in time. Between 2:12 to 2:24, the Senate recessed. Speaker Nancy Pelosi was ushered off the floor. The Capitol Police announced a breach and a lockdown, and the insurrectionist mob began chanting, "Hang Mike Pence." And it was unfolding on live TV in front of the entire world. So again, let me ask you, does it strike you as credible that nobody, not a single person, informed the president that his vice president had been evacuated, or that the president didn't glance at the television or his Twitter account and learn about the events that were happening? Remember, this was the day of the Electoral College. Remember his obsession with stopping the certification. It's just not credible that the president at no point knew his vice president was in this building and was in real danger. Senators, I submit to you these facts, this timeline is undisputed. At 2:24 p.m., after rioters breached the barriers, after calls for assistance, after rioters stormed the building, after Vice President Pence was rushed from the Senate floor, and just before Vice President Pence was further evacuated for his safety, President Trump decided to attack his own vice president on Twitter. The undisputed facts confirm that not only must President Trump have been aware of the vice president's danger, but he still sent out a tweet attacking him, further inciting the very mob that was in just a few feet of him inside of this very building. The vice president was there with his family. He was in danger for his life. They were chanting, "Hang Mike Pence," and had erected a noose outside. And as we've shown, the mob responded to President Trump's attack instantly. The tweet was read aloud on a bullhorn, if you remember that video. Insurrectionists began chanting again about Mike Pence. And in those critical moments, we see President Trump engaging in a dereliction of his duty by further inciting the mob in real time to target the vice president with knowledge that the insurrection was ongoing. And that's, of course, included in the conduct charged in this article of impeachment. The former president's counsel's suggestion otherwise is completely wrong. His further incitement is impeachable conduct that continued during the course of this assault itself, and it's part of the constitutional crime and was entirely and completely a part of his indefensible failure to protect the Congress. Now, there's been some confusion as to the phone call I referenced with Senator Lee. So I want to be clear about certain facts that are not in dispute. First, Senator Lee has confirmed that the call occurred at 2:26 p.m., so I've added that to the timeline above. Remember, by this phone call, the vice president has just been evacuated on live television for his own safety. And Donald Trump had, after that, tweeted an attack on him, which the insurgents read on a bullhorn. And a few minutes after Donald Trump's tweet, he didn't reach out to check on the vice president's safety. He called a senator to ask about delaying the certification. The call was interrupted. Senator Tuberville has since explained, and I quote, "I looked at the phone and it said the White House on it. I said, hello. The president said a few words. I said, Mr. President, they're taking the vice president out and they want me to get off the phone and I've got to go," end quote. That was his second evacuation that day. A minute later, live feeds documented the insurgents chanting, "Mike Pence is a traitor." At this point, even if somehow he'd missed it earlier, it's inconceivable that the former president, was unaware that the vice president was in danger. And what does the president do after hearing that? Does he rush to secure the Capitol? Does he do anything to quell the mob? Does he call his vice president to check on his safety? We all know the answer to those questions too. There can be no dispute. He took none of those steps, not a single one. Even after learning that senators were being evacuated, and that Vice President Pence had also been evacuated, he did nothing to help the vice president. And here's some more evidence that we've since learned. At some point over the following 30 minutes, President Trump spoke to Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy. And as Representative Jamie Herrera Butler has revealed, evidence that now has been stipulated as part of the evidentiary record. In that conversation, Kevin McCarthy is pleading with the former president to do something. He first tries to assign the blame to another group, and Leader McCarthy says, "No, these are your supporters, Mr. President." And what does the president say in response? Not, "Send people right away. I didn't realize you were in danger." He says, "Well, Kevin," and I quote, "Well, Kevin, I guess these people are more upset about the election than you are," end quote. I guess these people are more upset about the election than you are. The president, just as he conveyed in that tweet at 6:01, was essentially saying, "You got what you deserve." Let me say that again. Not only was the president fully aware of the vice president's situation, and the situation that we were all in, when he was asked for help, when he was asked to defend the Capitol less than 30 minutes after inciting this violence against his own vice president, President Trump refused that request for assistance. And he told us why. His singular focus, stopping the certification of the election of his opponent. He incited the violence to stop the certification. He attacked the vice president and further incited the insurrection to pressure the vice president to stop the certification. He called Senator Tuberville to stop the certification, and he refused to send help to Congress. And this Congress and the vice president of the United States were in mortal danger because he wanted to stop the certification. And he did these things, attacking the vice president, calling Senator Tuberville, refusing Representative McCarthy's request, with full knowledge of the violent attack that was underway at that point. He chose retaining his own power over the safety of Americans. I can't imagine more damning evidence of his state of mind. The call ended with a screaming match interrupted by violent rioters breaking through the windows of Representative McCarthy's office. Senators, the president knew this was happening. He didn't do anything to help his vice president or any of you or any of the brave officers and other employees serving the American people that day. His sole focus was stealing the election for himself. And he apparently has still not thought of anyone else. According to more new facts revealed last night, the vice president's team does not agree with the president's counsel or the president's counsel's assessment either. The report, and I quote, says, Pence His team does not agree with the Trump lawyers' assessment that Trump was concerned about Pence's safety. Trump didn't call him that day or for 5 days after that. No one else on Trump's team called as Pence was evacuated to one room in another with screaming mob nearby.
Objection, this is not in evidence. Objection, this is not in evidence. If you wanted a stipulation for this,
The council will sit down.
Senators, remember everyone.
Chair has no way of knowing what material is evidence or not. The council for the will have a chance to speak. And the chair will consider the issue.
Senators, remember, as one of you said during this attack, they could have killed us all. Our staff, the officers protecting all of us, everyone. And President Trump not only incited it, but continued inciting it as it occurred with attacks on his vice president, and then willfully refused to defend us, furthering his provocation and incitement by the mob, siding with the mob, siding with the violent insurrectionists, criminals who killed and injured police officers sworn to protect us because they were, quote, more upset about the election than Leader McCarthy. Those facts are undisputed. President Trump has not offered any evidence or any argument to disprove them. His lawyers almost entirely ignored these facts in their short presentation. We have only his counsel's false claim yesterday that, quote, at no point was the president informed that the vice president was in any danger, end quote. A claim that is refuted not just by common sense, but by the timeline you have seen and also the vice president's legal team. So there can be no doubt that at the moment we most needed a president to preserve, protect, and defend us, President Trump instead willfully betrayed us. He violated his oath. He left all of us and officers like Eugene Goodman to our own devices against an attack he had incited and he alone could stop. That is why he must be convicted. And I'd like to conclude by making one final point that follows directly from what I just discussed. Our case and the article of impeachment before you absolutely includes President Trump's dereliction of duty on January 6th. His failure as insider-in-chief to immediately quell or call off the mob, his failure as commander-in-chief to immediately do everything in his power to secure the Capitol, that is a further basis on which to convict, and there can be no doubt of that. The ongoing constitutional misconduct is like any continuing offense, and the proof of that is overwhelming. Most directly, his dereliction of duty offers conclusive, irrefutable evidence that he acted willfully as we charge. He wasn't furious or sad or shocked like virtually everyone else in America. He was reported by those around him as delighted. Rather than rush to our aid or demand his mob retreat, he watched the attack on TV and praised the mob to Leader McCarthy as more loyal to him, more upset about the election. And that was all that mattered. His reaction is also further evidence of his intent. He acted exactly the way a person would act if they had indeed incited the mob to violence to stop the steal. Moreover, as I've shown, President Trump's dereliction and desertion of duty includes his decision to further incite the mob, even as he failed to protect us. While the mob hunted Vice President Pence in these very halls, he attacked Vice President Pence. While he tried to stop the steal, he spread the big lie. We all saw how his mob responded in real time. This further incitement was part of his dereliction of duty, was also part of his course of conduct, encouraging and provoking the mob to violence. President Trump's dereliction of duty also highlights how foreseeable the attack was to him. In his tweet just after 6 p.m., he said, and I quote, "These are the things and events that happen when a sacred landslide election victory is so unceremoniously and viciously stripped away from great patriots who have been badly and unfairly treated for so long. This tweet continued his endorsement of the attack, his failure to condemn it, his desertion of duty. But it also reveals his view that this was, of course, what would happen when Congress refused his demand to reject the election that he continued to tell his supporters was stolen and he had actually won in a landslide. Again, he wasn't surprised. He saw this as a predictable result of his repeated demands that his followers stop the steal by any means possible. This was all connected. His dereliction of duty, his desertion of duty was part and parcel of the crime charged in the impeachment. And it's certainly a basis on which to vote for conviction. If you believe that he willfully refused to defend us and the law enforcement officers fighting to save us, and that he was delighted by the attack, and that he saw it as a natural result of his call to stop the steal, and that he continued to incite and target violence as the attack unfolded, we respectfully submit you must vote to convict and disqualify so that the events of January 6th can never happen again in this country.
Mr. President,
I'd like to call up Ms. Dean.
Mr. President, I've got a point of order. Mr. President, moments ago, House Manager Cicilline reported again.
The senator will withhold. I'm advised by the parliamentarian that debate is not in order.
That debate is not in order because this is not debate. He said something that's not true.
The quorum has been suggested.
There's clearly a quorum, sir.
And the clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Consent to suspend the quorum call.
Is there objection? Their objection is heard.
Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President,
The senator from Utah.
I withdraw my appeal.
The appeal withdrawn. The chair would advise everybody. The evidentiary record is closed. SRES 47 described the scope of those things not admitted to evidence as those referenced in trial. New evidence is not permitted in closing argument. References to such new evidence will be stricken. Addition. The House managers have the floor if they wish to resume. House managers.
Mr. President,
House manager.
esteemed senators, good afternoon. We are grateful for your kind attention this week as we engaged in a process formulated and put to paper by the founders in my home city of Philadelphia, which is getting its fair share of attention this week, in 1787, 234 years ago. My colleague, Mr. Cicilline, addressed the importance of the president's dereliction of duty. I will focus on three specific aspects of this case, which the defense have raised questions about. First, the defense suggests that this was just one speech, and one speech cannot incite insurrection. And the defense suggested, because the attack was pre-planned by some insurrectionists, Donald Trump is somehow not culpable. Both of these things are plainly not true, nor are they what we allege. So let's be clear. We are not suggesting that Donald Trump's January 6th speech by itself incited the attack. We have shown that his course of conduct leading up to and including that speech incited the attack. The defense is correct that the insurrection was pre-planned. That supports our point. We argued, and the evidence overwhelmingly confirms, that Donald Trump's conduct over many months incited his supporters to believe, one, his big lie, that the only way he could lose was if the election was rigged. Two, that to ensure the election would not be stolen, to prevent the fraud, they had to stop the steal. And three, they had to fight to stop the steal or they would not have a country anymore. This conduct took time, and it culminated in Donald Trump sending a save the date on December the 19th, 18 days before the attack, telling his base exactly when, where, and who to fight. And while he was doing this, he spent $50 million from his legal defense fund to simultaneously broadcast his message to stop the steal over all major networks. Donald Trump invited them, he incited them, then he directed them. Here are a few clips that will help bring that story to light.
Can you give a direct answer? You will accept the election?
I have to see. Look, I have to see. No, I'm not going to just say yes. And this election will be the most rigged election in history. This is going to be the greatest election disaster in history. And the only way they can take this election away from us is if this is a rigged election. We're going to win this election. Right. It's a rigged election. It's the only way we're going to lose.
Do you commit to making sure that there's a peaceful transfer of power?
We want to get rid of the ballots, and we'll have a very peaceful. There won't be a transfer, frankly. There'll be a continuation.
That's the only way we're going to lose is if there's mischief, and it'll have to be on a big scale. So be careful.
But this will be one of the greatest most fraudulent elections ever.
We're not going to let this election be taken away from us. That's the only way they're going to win it. This is a fraud. on the American public. This is an embarrassment to our country. We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election.
We were winning in all the key locations by a lot, actually. And then our numbers started miraculously getting whittled away in secret. And this is a case where they're trying to steal an election. They're trying to rig an election. And we can't let that happen.
You can't let another person steal that election from you. All over the country, people are together in holding up signs, "Stop the steal." If we don't root out the fraud, the tremendous and horrible fraud that's taken place in our 2020 election, we don't have a country anymore. We cannot allow a completely fraudulent election to stand. We're going to fight like hell, I'll tell you right now. If you don't fight to save your country with everything you have, you're not going to have a country left. We will not bend. We will not break. We will not yield. We will never give in. We will never give up. We will never back down. We will never, ever surrender. All of us here today do not want to see our election victory stolen. We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved. And to use a favorite term that all of you people really came up with, we will stop the steal, because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength, and you have to be strong. Make no mistake, this election was stolen from you, from me, and from the country, and we fight. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
Our point is this was not one speech. This was a deliberate, purposeful effort by Donald Trump over many months that resulted in the well-organized mob's attack on January the 6th. That brings me to my second point, the violence. Defense counsel argues that there is no way that Donald Trump could have known what would happen. Yet we are not suggesting, nor is it necessary for us to prove that Donald Trump knew every detail of what would unfold on January the 6th, or even how horrible and deadly the attack would become. But he did know. As he looked out on that sea of thousands in front of him, some wearing body armor and helmets, others carrying weapons, that the result would be violence. The evidence is overwhelming. The evidence overwhelmingly demonstrates this. A few points on this. Donald Trump knew the people he was inciting leading up to January the 6th. He saw the violence they were capable of. He had a pattern and practice of praising and encouraging supporters of violence, never condemning it. It is not a coincidence that those same people, the Proud Boys, the organizer of the Trump Caravan, the supporters and speakers at the 2nd Million MAGA March, all showed up on January the 6th. And Donald Trump's behavior was different. This was not just a comment by an official or a politician fighting for a cause. This was months of cultivating a base of people who were violent, praising that violence, and then leading that violence, that rage, straight to a joint session of Congress where he knew his vice president was presiding. And Donald Trump had warnings about the crowd in front of him on January 6th. There were detailed posts online of attack plans. Law enforcement warned that these posts were real threats and even made arrests in the days leading up to the attack. There were credible reports that many would be armed and ready to attack the Capitol. Despite these credible warnings of serious, dangerous threats to our Capitol, when the crowd was standing in front of the president, ready to take orders and attack, he said, "We're going to the Capitol, and we fight like hell, and if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore." Here's a short clip.
What do you want to call them? Give me a name. Give me a
White
name.
supremacists and
Who would
right
you like me to condemn?
White supremacists and right
Proud Boys, stand back and stand by.
Welcome to the kingdom. Yeah.
is something. Do you see the way our people, they were protecting his bus yesterday because they're nice. So his bus, they had hundreds of cars. Trump, and the American flag. That's it. You see Trump and American flag.
In the first Million MAGA March, we promised that if the GOP would not do everything in their power to keep Trump in office, then we would destroy the GOP. And as we gather here in Washington, D.C. for a second Million MAGA March, we're done making promises. It has to happen now. We are going to destroy the GOP. Yeah. Let's go! Destroy the GOP! Destroy the GOP!
Because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength and you have to be strong.
Senators, the violence on January the 6th was demonstrably foreseeable. Trump even said so himself at 6:01 p.m. the day of the attack. The last thing he said before he went to sleep, quote, "These are the things that happened," end quote. He foresaw this and he admitted as much. That brings me to my final point. The insurrectionists. Defense counsel has suggested these people came here on their own. The defense brief states that the insurrectionists, quote, did so for their own accord and for their own reasons and are being criminally prosecuted. It is true that some insurrectionists are being prosecuted, but it is not true that they did so of their own accord and for their own reasons. The evidence makes clear the exact opposite, that they did this for Donald Trump, at his invitation, at his direction, at his command. They said this before the attack, during the attack. They said it after the attack. Leading up to January the 6th, in post after post, the president's supporters confirmed this was for Donald Trump. It was at his direction. One supporter wrote, and I quote, "If Congress illegally certifies Biden, Trump would have absolutely no choice but to demand us to storm the Capitol and kill/beat them up for it." They even say publicly, openly, and proudly that President Trump would help them commandeer the National Guard. So all they have to do is overwhelm 2,000 Capitol Police officers. During his speech on January the 6th, Trump supporters chanted his words back to him. They even live tweeted his commands, as Ms. DeGette showed you. During the attack, the insurrectionists at the Capitol chanted Donald Trump's words from his tweets, rallies, and from the speech of the 6th. They held signs that said and chanted, "Fight for Trump, stop the steal." They read his tweets over bullhorns, amplifying his demands. Another rioter, while live streaming the insurrection from the Capitol, said, quote, "He'll be happy. We're fighting for Trump." What's more, the insurrectionists were not hiding. They believed they were following the orders from our commander-in-chief. They felt secure enough in the legitimacy of their actions to take selfies, to post photos and videos on social media. After the attack, rioter after rioter confirmed this too. Jenna Ryan, who was later accused for her role in the insurrection, said, quote, "I thought I was following my president. I thought we were following what we were called to do." And President Trump requested that we be in D.C. on the 6th. When it became clear that Donald Trump would not protect them, some of his supporters said they felt duped. They felt tricked. Listen to some of this evidence.
And even if they think for a second that they're going to get away with it today, they got another thing coming. Because today is just a day. And today is just the beginning. They haven't seen a resistance until they have seen a patriot fight for their country.
In the trial.
You died today.
Parties will withhold.
This is crooked.
The parties will withhold.
It is in the record.
The evidentiary record is closed. S. 47 described the scope of those things admitted into evidence as those referenced in trial. New evidence is not permitted in closing argument. References to such new evidence will be stricken. Who yields time?
Mr. President, the statement was in evidence, the slide was not, so we will withdraw the slide. But the statement was in evidence. They told you themselves they were following the president's orders. And you'll see something clearly. Donald Trump knew who these people were. As the slide shows, the people he cultivated, whose violence he praised, were all there on January the 6th. The Proud Boys who Donald Trump told to stand back and stand by in September of 2020. Keith Lee, organizer of the Trump caravan that tried to drive the Biden campaign bus off the road. Katrina Pearson, the speaker at the 2nd Million MAGA March. They were all there. The video you're about to see is in the record. Oh, correction. The record did include appropriately the last video. So we will keep that in the record, and I will keep it in my closing remarks. Can we play the next video?
Even know what they put in. Not play. They don't even know what they put in.
We're going to make them. We're going to have them. The transcript of the video. What forms of the record take? Not all. Okay. All right, well, can you show us where that is so we can be done with it? So we can stop doing it? Yeah. Andrew? Yeah, I have it in there.
Senators will take their seats. The Senate will be in order. Representative may continue.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have to say that of all the trials I have ever been a part of, this is certainly one of them. As the slides show, the people he cultivated, whose violence he praised, were all there on January the 6th. The Proud Boys who Donald Trump told to stand back and stand by in September of 2020, Keith Lee, the organizer of the Trump caravan that tried to drive the Biden campaign bus off the road, Katrina Pearson, the speaker at the second Million MAGA March, they were all there. Here is one final clip, also submitted in the record.
That's what we fucking need to have 30,000 guns.
Senators, some of the insurrectionists are facing criminal charges. Donald Trump was acting as our commander-in-chief. He was our president. He used his office and the authority it commands to incite an attack. And when Congress and the Constitution were under attack, he abandoned his duties, violated his oath, failing to preserve, protect, and defend. That is why we are here, because the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump, incited and directed thousands of people to attack the legislative branch. He knew what his supporters were capable of. He inflamed them, sent them down Pennsylvania Avenue, not on any old day, but on the day we were certifying the election results. As they were banging on our doors, he failed to defend us because this is what he wanted. He wanted to remain in power. For that crime against the Republic, he must be held accountable. Senators, the insurrectionists are still listening. Before I end, I must admit, until we were preparing for this trial, I didn't know the extent of many of these facts. I witnessed the horror, but I didn't know. I didn't know how deliberate the president's planning was, how he had invested in it, how many times he incited his supporters with these lies, how carefully and consistently he incited them to violence on January the 6th. While many of us may have tuned out his rallies, I also did not know the extent that his followers were listening, were hanging on his every word. And honestly, I did not know how close the mob actually came to their violent ends, that they were just steps away from all of us, that the death toll could have been much higher, but for the bravery of men and women who protected us. But now we know. We know the bravery of people like Officer Goodman and all the men and women of the Capitol Police, of the custodians who with pride and a sense of duty in their work cleaned up shattered glass, splintered wood, and blood-stained floors. We know the sacrifice of life and limb. We know what Donald Trump did. We know what he failed to do. Though it is difficult to bear witness and face the reality of what happened in these halls, what happens if we don't confront these facts? What happens if there is no accountability? For those who say we need to get past this, we need to come together, we need to unify. If we don't set this right and call it what it was, the highest of constitutional crimes by the President of the United States, the past will not be past. The past will become our future for my grandchildren and for their children. Senators, we are in a dialogue with history, a conversation with our past, with a hope for our future. 234 years from now, it may be that no one person here among us is remembered. And yet, what we do here, what is being asked of each of us here in this moment, will be remembered. History has found us. I ask that you not look the other way.
I'd now like to bring up Mr. Neguse.
Mr. President, distinguished senators, there's an old quote from Henry Clay, son of Kentucky, that courtesies of a small and trivial character are the ones that strike deepest in the grateful and appreciating heart. I want to say on behalf of all the House managers, we are very grateful for the courtesies that you've extended to us and to President's counsel during the course of this trial. You've heard my colleague, Manager Dean, go through the overwhelming evidence that makes clear that President Trump must be convicted and disqualified for his high crime. I'm not going to repeat that evidence. It speaks for itself. Earlier in this trial, you might recall a few days ago that I mentioned my expectation that President Trump's lawyers might do everything they could to avoid discussing the facts of this case. And I can understand why. I mean, the evidence that all of us presented, that Manager Dean just summarized, is pretty devastating. And so rather than address it, the president has offered up distractions, excuses, anything but actually trying to defend against the facts. They said things like, President Trump is now a private citizen, so the criminal justice system can deal with him, or that we haven't set a clear standard for incitement. They talked a lot about due process, and that all politicians say words like fight. I'd like to take a minute to explain why each of those distractions are precisely that, distractions, and why they do not prevent in any way the Senate from convicting President Trump. Number one, every president is one day a private citizen again. So, the argument that because President Trump has left office, he shouldn't be impeached for conduct committed while he was in office doesn't make sense. I mean, why would the Constitution include the impeachment power at all if the criminal justice system serves as a suitable alternative once a president leaves office? It wouldn't. Impeachment is a remedy separate and apart from the criminal justice system, and for good reason. The presidency, it comes with special powers, extraordinary powers, not bestowed on ordinary citizens. And if those powers are abused, they can cause great damage to our country, and they have to be dealt with in a separate forum. This forum. And it would be unwise to suggest that going forward, the only appropriate response to constitutional offenses committed by a president are criminal charges when the president returns to private life. That's not the kind of political system any of us want. And it's not the kind of constitutional system the framers intended. Second, it is true. We haven't cited criminal statutes establishing elements of incitement because, again, this isn't a criminal trial. It's not a criminal case. President Trump is charged with a constitutional offense, and you are tasked with determining whether or not he committed that high crime as understood by our framers. So the relevant question, which President Trump's lawyers would have you ignore, is would our framers have considered a president inciting a violent mob to attack our government while seeking to stop the certification of our elections? Would they have considered that an impeachable offense? Who among us really thinks the answer to that question is no? Third, due process. So, just to be absolutely clear, the House, with the sole power of impeachment, determines what the process looks like in the House, and the Senate does the same for the trial. During this trial, the president has counsel. They've argued very vigorously on his behalf. We had a full presentation of evidence, adversarial presentations, motions. The president was invited to testify. He declined. The president was invited to provide exculpatory evidence. He declined. You can't claim there's no due process when you won't participate in the process. And we know this case isn't one that requires a complicated legal analysis. You lived it. The managers and I, we lived it. Our country lived it. The president, in public view, right out in the open, incited a violent mob. A mob that temporarily, at least, stopped us from certifying an election. If there were ever an exigent circumstance, this is it. Number 4, we all know that President Trump's defense, as we predicted, spent a lot of time, a whole lot of time, comparing his conduct to other politicians, using words like fight. And of course, you saw the hours of video. As I said on Thursday, we trust you to know the difference. Because what you will not find in those video montages that they showed you is any of those speeches, those remarks culminating in a violent insurrection on our nation's capital. That's the difference. The president spent months inflaming his supporters to believe that the election had been stolen from him, from them, which was not true. He summoned the mob, assembled the mob, and when the violence erupted, he did nothing to stop it, instead inciting it further. Senators, all of these arguments offered by the president have one fundamental thing in common. One. They have nothing to do with whether or not, factually, whether or not the president incited this attack. They've given you a lot of distractions so they don't have to defend what happened here on that terrible day. And they do that because they believe those distractions are going to work. That you'll ignore the president's conduct instead of confronting it. I think they're wrong. Some of you know this already. I'm the youngest member of our manager team by quite a few years. So perhaps I'm a bit naive, but I just don't believe that. I really don't. I don't believe their effort is going to work. And here is why. Because I know what this body is capable of. I may not have witnessed it, but I've read about it in the history books. I've seen the C-SPAN footage. Archives, sometimes I've watched them for hours. And yes, I've actually done that. And the history of our country in those books and in those tapes, the history of this country has been defined right here on this floor. The 13th Amendment, the amendment abolishing slavery, was passed in this very room. In this room, not figuratively, literally, where you all sit and where I stand. In 1964, this body, with the help of senators like John Sherman Cooper and so many others, this body secured passage of the Civil Rights Act. We made the decision to enter World War II from this chamber. We've certainly had our struggles, but we've always risen to the occasion when it mattered the most. Not by ignoring injustice or cowering to bullies and threats, but by doing the right thing, by trying to do the right thing. And that's why so many nations around the world aspire to be like America. They stand up to dictators and autocrats and tyrants because America is a guiding light for them, a North Star. They do so, they look to us because we have been a guiding light, a north star in these moments. Because the people who sat in your chairs, when confronted with choices that define us, rose to the occasion. I want to offer one more example of a decision made in this room by this body that resonated with me. The first day I stood up in this trial, I mentioned that I was the son of immigrants, like many of you, and many senators graciously approached me after my presentation and asked me where my parents were from. And I told those who asked that my folks were from East Africa. In 1986, this body considered a bill to override President Reagan's veto of legislation imposing sanctions on South Africa during apartheid. 2 senators who sit in this room, one Democrat and one Republican, voted to override that veto. That vote was not about gaining political favor. And in fact, it was made despite potentially losing political favor. And I have to imagine that that vote was cast, like the decisions before it, are moments that transcend party politics and that require us to put country above our party because the consequences of not doing so are just too great. Senators, this is one of those moments. Many folks who are watching today's proceedings may not know this, but House members like me and Lead Manager Raskin, our fellow managers, we're not allowed on the Senate floor without express permission. No one is. Certainly the senators are aware of that. This floor is sacred. It's one of the reasons why I, like so many of you, was so offended to see it desecrated by that mob. To see those insurrectionists diminishing and devaluing and disrespecting these hallowed halls that my whole life I have held in such awe. Because of those rules that I just mentioned, this will be the only time I have the privilege to stand before you like this. When the trial's over, I'll go back to being not an impeachment manager, but back to being just a House member. The trial will end. We'll resume our lives and our work. But for some, there will be no end to the pain of what happened on January 6th. The officers who struggled to recover from the injuries they sustained to protect us. They struggle to recover today. The families who continue to mourn those who they lost on that terrible, tragic day. I was struck yesterday by defense counsel's continued references to hate. One of my favorite quotes of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., it's one that has sustained me during times of adversity, I suspect it sustained some of you, is that I've decided to stick with love, that hate is too great a burden to bear. This trial is not born from hatred. Far from it. It's born from love of country, our country, our desire to maintain it, our desire to see America at its best. And in those moments that I spoke of, Civil Rights Act, so much more, we remember those moments because they helped define and enshrine America at its best. I firmly believe that our certification of the Electoral College votes in the early hours of January 7th, our refusal to let our republic be threatened and taken down by a violent mob, will go down in history as one of those moments too. And I believe that this body can rise to the occasion once again today. by convicting President Trump, defending our republic. And the stakes could not be higher. Because the cold, hard truth is that what happened on January 6th can happen again. I fear, like many of you do, that the violence we saw on that terrible day may be just the beginning. We've shown you the ongoing risks, the extremist groups who grow more emboldened every day. Senators, this cannot be the beginning. It can't be the new normal. It has to be the end. And that decision is in your hands.
Mr. President,
Mr. Raskin.
Senators, my daughter Hannah said something to me last night that stopped me cold and brought me up short. Kids have been very moved by all the victims of the violence, the officers and their families. But Hannah told me last night she felt really sorry for the kid of a man who said goodbye to his children before he left home to come and join Trump's actions. Their father had told them that their dad might not be coming home again and they might never see him again. In other words, he was expecting violence. He might die, as insurrectionists did. And that shook me. Hannah said, how can the president put children and people's families in that situation and then just run away from the whole thing? That shook me. And I was filled with self-reproach because when I first saw the line about, your father going to Washington and you might not see him again, I just thought about it, well, like a prosecutor, like a manager. I thought, what damning evidence that is, that people are expecting lethal violence at a protest called by the President of the United States and saying their final goodbyes to their kids. But Hannah, my dear Hannah, thought of it like a human being. She thought of it, if you'll forgive me, like a patriot. Someone who just lost her brother and doesn't want to see any other kids in America go through that kind of agony and grief. Senators, when I say all three of my kids are better than me, you know that I am not engaged in idle flattery. Maybe some of you feel the same way about your kids. They're literally better people than me. They've got a lot of their mom, Sarah Bloom Raskin, in them. They're better than me. And Hannah saw through the legality of the situation. She saw through the politics of the situation, all the way to the humanity of the situation, the morality of the situation. That was one of the most patriotic things I ever heard anybody say. The children of the insurrectionists, even the violent and dangerous ones, they're our children too. They are Americans, and we must take care of them and their future. We must recognize and exercise these crimes against our nation, and then we must take care of our people and our children, their hearts and their minds. As Tommy Raskin used to say, it's hard to be human. Many of the Capitol and Metropolitan police officers and guardsmen and women who were beaten up by the mob also have kids. You remember Officer Fanone, who had a heart attack after being tased and roughed up for hours by the mob, and then begged for his life, telling the insurrectionists that he had 4 daughters. And that just about broke my heart all over again. We talked about this for a long time last night. My kids felt terrible that other kids, fathers and mothers, were pulled into this nightmare by a president of the United States. Senators, we proved he betrayed his country. We proved he betrayed his Constitution. We proved he betrayed his oath of office. The startling thing to recognize now is that he is even betraying the mob. He told them he would march with them, and he didn't. They believed the president was right there with them somewhere in the crowd, fighting the fantasy conspiracy to steal the election and steal their country away from them. They thought they were one big team working together. He told them their great journey together was just beginning, and now there are hundreds of criminal prosecutions getting going all over the country. People getting set to say goodbye to members of their family. And the president who contacted them, solicited them, lured them, invited them, incited them, that president has suddenly gone quiet and dark. Nowhere to be found. He cannot be troubled to come here to tell us what happened and tell us why this was the patriotic and the constitutional thing to do. Senators, this trial in the final analysis is not about Donald Trump. The country and the world know who Donald Trump is. This trial is about who we are. Who we are. My friend Dar Williams says that sometimes the truth is like a second chance. We've got a chance here with the truth. Do we still believe in the separation of powers? President Trump tried to sideline or run over every other branch of government, thwart the will of the people at the state level, usurp the people's choice for president. This case is about whether our country demands a peaceful, nonviolent transfer of power to guarantee the sovereignty of the people. Are we going to defend the people who defend us? Not just honor them with medals, as you rightfully did yesterday, but actually back them up against savage, barbaric, insurrectionary violence? Will we restore the honor of our capital and the people who work here? Will we be a democratic nation that the world looks to for understanding democratic values and practices and constitutional government and the rights of women and men? Will the Senate condone the President of the United States inciting a violent attack on our chambers, our offices, our staff, and the officers who protect us? When you see the footage of Officer Hodges stuck in the doorway, literally being tortured by the mob, if government did that to you, that would be torture. And when you see that footage and he's shouting in agony for his dear life, it's almost unwatchable. When the Vice President of the United States escapes a violent mob that's entered this Capitol building, seeking to hang him and calling out traitor, 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 and when they shut down the counting of the Electoral College votes, is this the future you imagine for our kids? Is it totally appropriate, as we've been told? Or as Representative Cheney said, is it the greatest betrayal of the presidential oath of office in the history of our country? And if we can't handle this together as a people, all of us, forgetting the lines of party and ideology and geography and all of those things, if we can't handle this, how are we ever going to conquer the other crises of our day? Is this America? Is this what we want to bequeath to our children and our grandchildren? I was never a great Sunday school student. Actually, I was pretty truant most of the time. But one line always stuck with me from the book of Exodus as both beautiful and haunting, even as a kid, after I asked what the words meant. Thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil. Thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil. The officer who got called the N-word 15 times and spent hours with his colleagues battling insurrectionists who had metal poles and baseball bats and hockey sticks, bear spray, and Confederate battle flags, posed the right question to the Senate and to all of us. Is this America? Dear senators, that's going to be up to you now. In whatever committees and subcommittees you're on, whatever you came to Washington to do, to work on, from defense to agriculture to energy to aerospace to healthcare, this is almost certainly how you will be remembered by history. That might not be fair. It really might not be fair, but none of us can escape the demands of history and destiny right now. Our reputations and our legacy will be inextricably intertwined with what we do here and with how you exercise your oath to do impartial justice. Impartial justice. I know and I trust you will do impartial justice, driven by your meticulous attention to the overwhelming facts of the case and your love for our Constitution, which I know dwells in your heart. The times have found us, said Tom Paine, the namesake of my son. The times have found us. Is this America? What kind of America will we be? It's now literally in your hands. Godspeed to the Senate of the United States. We reserve any remaining time.
The House is reserved 28 minutes.
Proceed.
I'm talking, and it will not be so long. And before I start my prepared closing, I really want to clean up a few things from the mess that was the closing of the House managers. I do not want to ruin my closing because I think the ending's pretty good. What they didn't, they started off by misstating the law, and they started off by misstating the intent of our stipulation. What we did today was stipulate to an article that was published in a magazine. Apparently they've had for weeks, according to the documents they produced today, but for some reason this morning popped up with it. The stipulation was that they can put that in. We did not stipulate to its contents for truthfulness. And they tried to portray that in their closing as the stipulation. The stipulation was read into the record. The proponents of that conversation, the real ones, have denied its content, its veracity. With respect to, I'm not going to talk much about the tortured analysis of our arson laws that started off, or the truly sideways analogies that were used with fires. What I do want to talk about, though, is the doctoring of evidence. First of all, they sent us their evidence on Tuesday the 9th at 2:32 p.m. by email. I was in this room trying the case already when they sent their evidence. Due process. They used evidence that was flat wrong 2 or 3 nights ago with Senator Lee and had to withdraw it. They tried to use it again today. They tried to use evidence that they had never presented in the case in their closing argument. That is a very desperate attempt by a prosecuting team, 9 of them, by a prosecuting team that knew that their case has collapsed. Their closing did not mention one piece of law. They didn't talk about the Constitution once. They didn't talk about the First Amendment and its application. They didn't talk about due process and how it applies to this proceeding for my client. Basic rule of any court is that when you close a case out, you close on the facts that were admitted in the trial. It's a basic, fundamental principle of due process and fairness. And that was violently breached today on multiple occasions. And you have to ask yourself, why? Why did they resort to those tactics at this moment in time? Senators, good afternoon, Mr. President. What took place here at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th was a grave tragedy. Over the course of this trial, you have heard no one on either side of this debate argue that the infiltration of the Capitol was anything less than a heinous act on the home of American democracy. All of us, starting with my client, are deeply disturbed by the graphic videos of the Capitol attack that have been shown in recent days. The entire team condemned and have repeatedly condemned the violence and law-breaking that occurred on January 6th in the strongest possible terms. We've advocated that everybody be found, punished to the maximum extent of the law. Yet the question before us is not whether there was a violent insurrection of the Capitol. On that point, everyone agrees. Based on the explicit text of the House impeachment article, this trial is about whether Mr. Trump willfully engaged in incitement of violence and even insurrection against the United States. And that question they have posed in their article of impeachment has to be set up against the law of this country. No matter how much truly horrifying footage we see of the conduct of the rioters and how much emotion has been injected into this trial, that does not change the fact that Mr. Trump is innocent of the charges against him. Despite all of the video played, at no point in their presentation did you hear the House managers play a single example of Mr. Trump urging anyone to engage in violence of any kind. At no point did you hear anything that could ever possibly be construed as Mr. Trump encouraging or sanctioning an insurrection. Senators, you did not hear those tapes because they do not exist, because the act of incitement never happened. He engaged in no language of incitement whatsoever on January 6th or any other day following the election. No unbiased person honestly reviewing the transcript of Mr. Trump's speech on the ellipse could possibly believe that he was suggesting violence. He explicitly told the crowd that he expected the protest outside the Capitol to be peaceful and patriotic. They claim that's not enough. His entire premise was that the proceedings of the joint session should continue. He spent nearly the entire speech talking about how he believes the senators and members of Congress should vote on the matter. It's the words. The Supreme Court ruled in Brandenburg that there is a very clear standard for incitement. In short, you have to look at the words themselves. The words have to either explicitly or implicitly call for lawlessness or violence. Whether the speech, you have to determine whether the speech was intended to provoke the lawlessness and whether the violence was the likely result of the word itself. They fail on all three prongs. The false and defamatory claim that Mr. Trump gave a speech encouraging his supporters to go attack the Capitol has been repeated so often, uncritically, without any examination of the underlying facts that the Americans listening at home were probably surprised to learn it's not true. Furthermore, some of the people in this room followed Mr. Trump's statements and tweets in the weeks leading up to January 6th very closely. We know that he was not trying to foment an insurrection during the time because no one, from the Speaker of the House to the mayor of Washington, D.C., behaved in a fashion consistent with the belief that violence was being advocated for. Mr. Trump did not spend the weeks prior to January 6th inciting violence. He spent those weeks pursuing his election challenge through the court system and other legal procedures exactly as the Constitution and the Congress prescribe. To believe, based on the evidence you have seen, that Mr. Trump actually wanted and indeed willfully incited an armed insurrection to overthrow the U.S. government would be absurd. The gathering on January 6th was supposed to be an entirely peaceful event. Thousands and thousands of people, including Mr. Trump, showed up that day with that intention. A small percentage, a small fraction of those people then engaged in truly horrible behavior, but as we now know, that those actors were pre-planned and premeditated and acted even before the speech was completed, to which is the basis of the article of impeachment. It was pre-planned and premeditated by fringe left and right groups. They hijacked the event for their own purposes. The House manager's false narrative is a brazenly dishonest attempt to smear, to cancel constitutional cancel culture, their number one political opponent, taking neutral statements, commonplace political rhetoric, removing words and facts from context, and ascribing to them the most sinister and malevolent intentions possible. Their story was based not on evidence, but on the sheer personal and political animus. The flimsy theory of incitement you heard from the House managers could be used to impeach, indict, or expel countless other political leaders. Many leading figures in other parties have engaged in far more incendiary and dangerous rhetoric. And we played some of it. I'm not going to replay it. I'm not going to replay you the words. You all saw the evidence. I'm not going to replay you mob scenes. I don't want to give those people another platform, any more view from the American people as to what they did. They should be canceled. Democrat politicians spent months prior to January 6th attacking the very legitimacy of our nation's most cherished institutions and traditions. They didn't just question the integrity of one election, they challenged the integrity of our entire nation. Everything from our founding fathers, our Constitution, Declaration of Independence, law enforcement officers, and United States military. They said that our society was rooted in hatred. They even said that America deserved, and I'll quote, a reckoning. As you heard yesterday, throughout the summer, Democrat leaders, including the current president and vice president, repeatedly made comments that provided moral comfort to mobs attacking police officers. During that time, many officers across the country were injured. As we all know, 2 sheriff's deputies in Los Angeles were ambushed and shot at point-blank range. Members of this very body have been in danger. Senators from Maine to Kentucky and most points in between have been harassed by mobs. Last August, a menacing left-wing mob swarmed Senator Rand Paul and his wife as they left the White House, and they had to be rescued by police. For months, our federal courthouse in Portland was placed under siege by violent anarchists who attacked law enforcement officers daily and repeatedly and tried to set fire to the building. Speaker Pelosi did not call the violent siege of the federal building an insurrection. She called the federal agents protecting the courthouse stormtroopers. The White House complex was besieged by mobs that threw bricks, rocks, and bottles at Secret Service agents, set fire to an historic structure, and breached a security fence to infiltrate the Treasury grounds. When my client's administration sent in the National Guard to secure the nation's capital city amidst the violence, Democrat leaders demanded that the forces be withdrawn. The Washington, D.C. mayor said the presence of the National Guard was an affront to the safety of the district. It must be fully investigated whether political leadership here in Washington, D.C. took an inadequate and irresponsible forced posture on January 6th because of their commitment to the false narrative of what happened last June. Hopefully, we can all now agree that the administration acted properly by taking action to stop a riotous mob, establishing an appropriate security perimeter, and prevent the White House from potentially being overrun. The House managers argued this week that an alleged brief delay in issuing a public statement from Mr. Trump on January 6th was somehow evidence that he committed incitement or supported the violence. Yet for months last year, Joe Biden, Vice President Harris, and countless of other Democrats repeatedly refused to condemn the extremism as riots were occurring daily, as businesses were being ramshackled, as neighborhoods were being burned, as bombs were exploding. They repeatedly refused to tell their violent supporters to stand down. Some even suggested that the mob's actions were justified. Vice President Harris literally urged her followers to donate money to a fund to bail out the violent, extreme rioters so that they could get out and continue to do it over and over again. She later said that those folks were not going to let up and that they should not. All of this was far closer to the actual definition of incitement than anything President Trump has ever said or done, never mind what he said on the 6th. It's a hypocrisy. It's a hypocrisy that the House managers have laid at the feet of this chamber. The House managers suggested in this recent history is irrelevant to the current proceedings. But not only is Democrats' behavior surrounding last year's riots highly relevant as precedent, and not only does it reveal the dishonesty and insincerity of this entire endeavor, it also provides crucial context that should inform our understanding of the events that took place on January 6th. Many of the people who infiltrated the Capitol took pictures of themselves and posted them on social media. To some, it seems, they thought that it was all a game. They apparently believed that violent mobs, destruction of property, rioting, assaulting police, and vandalizing historic treasures was somehow now acceptable in the United States. Where might they have gotten that idea? I would suggest to you that it was not from Mr. Trump. It was not Mr. Trump. It was not anyone in the Republican Party that spent the 6 months immediately prior to the Capitol assault giving rhetorical aid and comfort to mobs, making excuses for rioters, celebrating radicalism, and explaining that angry, frustrated, and marginalized people were entitled to blow off steam like that. Let me be very clear. There can be no excuse for the depraved actions of the rioters here at the Capitol or anywhere else across this country. 100% of those guilty of committing crimes deserve lengthy prison sentences for their shameful and depraved conduct. But this trial has raised the question about words, actions, and consequences. As a nation, we must ask ourselves, how did we arrive at this place where rioting and pillaging would become commonplace? I submit to you that it was month after month of political leaders and media personalities bloodthirsty for ratings, glorifying civil unrest, and condemning the reasonable law enforcement measures that are required to quell violent mobs. Hopefully, we can all leave this chamber in uniform agreement that all rioting is bad, and that law enforcement deserves our respect and support. That has been Mr. Trump's position from the very beginning. The real question in this case is, who is ultimately responsible for such acts of mayhem and violence when they are committed? The House Democrats want two different standards, one for themselves and one for their political opposition. They have carried out a grossly unconstitutional effort to punish Mr. Trump for protected First Amendment speech. It's an egregious violation of his constitutional rights. Since he uttered not a single word encouraging violence, this action can only be seen as an effort to censor disfavored political speech and discriminate against a disapproved viewpoint. It is an unprecedented action with the potential to do grave and lasting damage to both the presidency and the separation of powers and the future of democratic self-government. Yesterday, we played you a video of countless Democrat members of the Senate urging their supporters to fight. We showed you those videos not because we think you should be forcibly removed from office for saying those things, but because we know you should not be forcibly removed from office for saying those things. But recognize the hypocrisy. Yesterday, in questioning, House Manager Raskin admitted that the House Democrats had invented an entirely new legal standard. In fact, they've created a new legal theory, the Raskin Doctrine. The Raskin Doctrine is based on nothing more than determining protected speech based on the party label next to your name. Regardless of what you have heard or what you have seen from the House managers, if you pay close attention, you will see that any speech made by Democrat elected officials is protected speech, while any speech made by Republican elected officials is not protected. The creation of the Raskin Doctrine actually reveals the weakness of the House manager's case. Elected officials, and we reviewed this in depth yesterday, under Supreme Court precedent, Wood and Bond, and by the way, Bond didn't burn his draft card. He actually still had it. It was part of his defense. But in Bond and in Wood, the court clearly directed all to know that elected officials hold the highest protections of speech, the highest protections. And I remind you why. because you all need to be free to have robust political discussion, because your discussion is about how our lives are going to go. And that shouldn't be squelched by any political party on either side of the aisle, no matter who's the majority party at the time. Why would the House managers make up their own legal standard? I'll tell you why. Because they know they cannot satisfy the existing constitutional standard set forth by the United States Supreme Court that has existed for more than half a century. They argue Mr. Trump, as an elected official, has no First Amendment rights. It's the complete opposite of the law. We've shown you without contradiction that is wrong. They also know that they cannot satisfy the three-part test of Brandenburg, as elucidated in the Bible Believers case. There was absolutely no evidence that Mr. Trump's words were directed to inciting imminent lawless action. There was no evidence that Mr. Trump intended his words to incite violence, and the violence was pre-planned and premeditated by a group of lawless actors who must be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, but it proves that his words weren't what set this into motion. What was the incitement? With no ability and no evidence to satisfy the existing constitutional standards, what are the House managers to do? They had to make up their own law. This is not only intellectually dishonest, folks, it's downright scary. What type of precedent would be set if the Senate did vote to convict? Can Congress now ignore Supreme Court precedent on the contours of protected free speech? Will Congress be permitted to continually make up their own legal standards and apply those new standards to elected officials' speech? This would allow Congress to use the awesome impeachment power as a weapon to impeach their fellow colleagues in the opposing party. This is not a precedent that this Senate can set here today. If the Senate endorses the House Democrats' absurd new theory, you will set a precedent that will trouble leaders from both parties, literally, for centuries to come. But that will not be the only disgraceful precedent to come from this case. This has been perhaps the most unfair and flagrantly unconstitutional proceeding in the history of the United States Senate. For the first time in history, Congress has asserted the right to try and punish a former president who is a private citizen. Nowhere in the Constitution is the power enumerated or implied. Congress has no authority, no right, and no business holding a trial of Citizen Trump, let alone a trial to deprive him of fundamental civil rights. There was mention of a January exception argument. The January exception argument is a creation of the House managers' own conduct by delaying. They sat on the article. They could have tried the president while he was still in office if they really believed he was an imminent threat. They didn't. The January exception is a red herring. It's nonsense. Because federal, state, and local authorities can investigate. Their January exception always expires on January 20th. House Democrats and this deeply unfair trial have shamefully trampled every tradition, norm, and standard of due process in a way I've never, ever seen before. Mr. Trump was given no right to review the so-called evidence against him at trial. He was given no opportunity to question its propriety. He was given no chance to engage in fact-finding. Much of what was introduced by the House was unverified, second or third-hand reporting cribbed from a biased news media, including stories based on anonymous sources whose identities aren't even known to them. Never mind my client. They manufactured and doctored evidence, so much so that they had to withdraw it. We had the evidence after we started the trial. They went on for 2 days. So in the evening, I was able to go back and take a really close look at the stuff. Myself and Mr. Castor and Ms. Bateman and Mr. Brennan, we all worked hard and looked at the evidence, 4 volumes of books in little tiny print. And we literally had, 12, 14 hours to really look at the evidence before we had to go on. And just in that short time of looking at the evidence, we saw them fabricating Twitter accounts. We saw the masked man sitting at his desk with the New York Times there. And when we looked closely, we found that the date was wrong, the check had been added. They fabricated evidence. They made it up. They never addressed that in their closing, as though it were acceptable, as though it were all right, as though that's the way it should be done here in the Senate of the United States of America. Fraud, flat out, fraud. Where I come from, in the courts that I practice in, there are very harsh repercussions for what they pulled in this trial. As we have shown, the House managers were caught creating false representations of tweets, manipulating videos, and introducing into the record completely discredited lies such as the Fine People hoax as factual evidence. Most of what the House managers have said and shown you would be inadmissible in any respectable court of law. They were not trying a case. They were telling a political tale, a fable, and a patently false one at that. House Democrats have denied due process and rushed the impeachment because they know that a fair trial would reveal Mr. Trump's innocence of the charges against him. The more actual evidence that comes out, the clearer it is that this was a pre-planned and premeditated attack, which his language in no way incited. Because their case is so weak, the House managers have taken a kitchen sink approach to the supposedly single article of impeachment. They allege that Mr. Trump incited the January 6th violence. They allege that he abused power by attempting to pressure Georgia Secretary of State Raffensperger to undermine the results of the 2020 election. And they allege that he gravely and endangered the democratic system by interfering with the peaceful transition of power. It's at least 3 things there. Under the Senate rules, each of these allegations must have been alleged in a separate article of impeachment. I need not remind this chamber that Rule 23 of the rules of procedure and practice in the Senate when sitting on impeachment trials provides, in pertinent part, that an article of impeachment shall not be divisible thereon. Why is that? Because the article at issue here alleges multiple wrongs in the single article, it would be impossible to know if 2/3 of the members agreed on the entire article or just on parts of it as the basis for a vote to convict. Based on this alone, the Senate must vote to acquit Mr. Trump. You got to at least obey your own rules if it's not the Constitution you're going to obey. In short, this impeachment has been a complete charade from beginning to end. The entire spectacle has been nothing but the unhinged pursuit of a long-standing political vendetta against Mr. Trump by the opposition party. As we have shown, Democrats were obsessed with impeaching Mr. Trump from the very beginning of his term. The House Democrats tried to impeach him in his first year. They tried to impeach him in his second year. They did impeach him in his third year, and they impeached him again in his fourth year. And now they have conducted a phony impeachment show trial when he is a private citizen out of office. This hastily orchestrated and unconstitutional circus is the House Democrats' final desperate attempt to accomplish their obsessive desire of the last 5 years. Since the moment he stepped into the political arena, since my client stepped in, they have been possessed by an overwhelming zeal to vanquish an independent-minded outsider from the midst and to shame, demean, silence, and demonize his supporters in the desperate hope that they will never, ever pose an electoral challenge. We heard one of the congressmen on the screen. If you don't impeach him, he might be elected again. That's the fear. That's what's driving this impeachment. When you deliberate over your decision, there are 4 distinct grounds under which you must acquit my client. First is jurisdiction. There is no jurisdiction. And if you believe that, you still get to say it. 2, Rule 23. It had to be divisible. Each allegation had to be singularly set out in front of you so it could be voted on and to see if 2/3 of you think that they proved that case or not. They didn't do that. You got to ask yourself why. They know the Senate rules. They got them, and so did I. Why'd they do it? Because they hadn't investigated, first of all. But also, what they found out as they were preparing all of this, they couldn't do it. So if they threw as much in as they could and made as many bold, bald allegations as they could, then maybe 2/3 of you would fall for it. That's why the rules don't allow it to go that way. Due process, I've exhausted that subject. It's a really good reason for all of you in this chamber, to stop the politics, to read the Constitution and apply it to this proceeding, and acknowledge that the lack of due process, way over the top, shocking, and you must not stand for it. And of course, the First Amendment, the actual facts of this case, there were no words of incitement. 4 grounds. Nobody gets to tell you which ground to pick, and nobody gets to tell you how many grounds to consider. Senators, do not let House Democrats take this manacle crusade any further. The Senate does not have to go down this dark path of enmity and division. You do not have to indulge the impeachment lust, the dishonesty, and the hypocrisy. It is time to bring this unconstitutional political theater to an end. It is time to allow our nation to move forward. It is time to address the real business pressing this nation: the pandemic, our economy, racial inequality, economic and social inequality. These are the things that you need to be thinking and working on for all of us in America. All of us. With your vote, you can defend the Constitution, you can protect due process, and you can allow America's healing to begin. I urge the Senate to acquit and vindicate the Constitution of this great republic. Thank you.
Who yields time?
Mr. President, Senators, I understand, I'm told we have around 27 minutes, but I will return all of that, but perhaps 5 back to you. There's just a few things that I need to address. And so in an extraordinary and perhaps unprecedented act of self-restraint on my part, I will resist the opportunity to rebut every single false and illogical thing that you just heard. And I am going to be able to return to you, perhaps 22 or 23 minutes. Few points. One, we have definitely made some progress in the last few days, because a few days ago, the president's team, although I think it was perhaps a member who has since left the team, lectured us that this was not an insurrection and said that the impeachment managers were outrageous in using the word insurrection. Today, counsel in his closing statement said it was a violent insurrection, and he denounced it. And I would certainly love to see President Trump also call it a violent insurrection and denounce it too. And I believe, although I don't have a verbatim text, that counsel called for long sentences for the people who were involved. Again, I would love to hear that come from the president as well. The distinguished counsel complains that there's no precedent with the developed body of law that the Senate has for impeaching and convicting a president who incites violent insurrection against the Congress and the government of the United States. Well, I suppose that's true because it never occurred to any other president of the United States, from George Washington to John Adams to Thomas Jefferson to James Madison to James Monroe to Abraham Lincoln to Ronald Reagan to George W. Bush to Barack Obama, to incite a violent insurrection against the Union. You're right, we've got no precedent for that. And so they think that that somehow is a mark in their favor. That's a score for them, that this Senate has to be the first one to define incitement of violent insurrection against the Union. And so the gentleman puts it on me. He says, inciting a president for committing incitement to violent insurrection against the Union is the new Raskin doctrine. We've tried to convince him that there are well-known principles and elements of incitement which we have talked to you about ad nauseum, and that this is an intrinsically, inherently fact-based judgment. But if that is the Raskin doctrine, that a president of the United States cannot incite violent insurrection against the Union and the Congress, then I embrace it, and I take it as an honor. Most law professors never even get a doctrine named after them. So I will accept that. And finally, the counsel goes back to Julian Bond's case, because I think in the final analysis, their best argument, as pathetically weak as it is really about the First Amendment. But remember, they keep talking about stifling President Trump's speech. Someone tell me when his speech has ever been stifled. He says exactly what he wants, whenever he wants. If and when you convict him for incitement of insurrection, he will continue to say whatever he wants on that day. Remember, they referred yesterday to interference with his liberty, which I found absolutely bizarre, because everybody knows that he will not spend 1 minute in prison or jail from conviction on these charges. It is a civil remedy to protect all of us, to protect the entire country, our children, our Constitution, our future. That's what impeachment, trial, conviction are all about. Julian Bond. See, I knew Julian Bond, so forgive me. Most people say, don't even respond to this stuff. I got to respond to this, okay? Julian Bond was a civil rights activist who decided to go into politics, like the people in this room, like all of us who are in politics. And they tried to keep him out. He was a member of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which really launched the voting rights movement in America. It's a great story that Bob Moses tells in his book called Radical Equations about, he was a graduate student in mathematics at Harvard, and he went down to Mississippi. You know why? Because he saw a picture in the New York Times of black civil rights protesters, college students, I think in North Carolina, AT&T, and he saw a picture of them on the cover of the New York Times, and they were sitting in at a lunch counter, and he looked at the picture and he said, they looked the way that I felt. They looked the way that I felt. And he said he had to go down south to Mississippi. And they launched the voting rights movement. That's where the phrase one person, one vote comes from. It was not invented by the Supreme Court. They would go door to door to try to register people to vote. But anyway, Julian Bond was part of that movement. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, nonviolence. It was the end and it was the means, nonviolence. And he ran for the state legislature in Georgia, a path other civil rights activists followed, like our great, late, beloved colleague, John Lewis, who's in our hearts today. And when he got elected, they wanted to try to keep him from being sworn into the Georgia legislature. And so they said, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee is taking a position against the Vietnam War. You're a member of SNCC. We're not going to admit you because you took a position against the Vietnam War. And the Supreme Court, in its wisdom, said you cannot prevent someone from swearing an oath to become a member of a legislative body because of a position that they took or a group they were a part of took before they got sworn in. That's the exact opposite of Donald Trump. He got elected to office. He swore an oath to the Constitution to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. He served as president for 4 years, right up until the end, when he wanted to exercise his rights under the imaginary January exception, and he incited a violent mob and insurrection to come up here, and we all know what happened. He is being impeached and convicted for violating his oath of office that he took. He's not being prevented from taking his oath in the first place. The First Amendment's on our side. He tried to overturn the will of the people, the voice of the people. He lost that election by more than 7 million votes. Some people don't want to admit it. Counsel for the president could not bring themselves to admit that the election's over. In answer to the question from the distinguished gentleman from Vermont, he refused to answer that. He said it was irrelevant, despite all of the evidence you've heard about the big lie and how that set the stage for his incitement of the insurrectionary violence against us. First Amendment is on our side. We are defending the Bill of Rights. We are defending the constitutional structure. We are defending the separation of powers. We're defending the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House against a president who acted no better than a marauder and a member of that mob by inciting those people to come here. And in many ways, he was worse. He named the date, he named the time, and he brought them here, and now he must pay the price. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Raskin. The
Mr. President.
Majority Leader is recognized.
Mr. President, the Senate is now ready to vote on the article of impeachment. And after that is done, we will adjourn the court of impeachment.
The clerk will read the article of impeachment.
Article 1, incitement of an insurrection.
Senate will be in order.
The Constitution provides that the House of Representatives shall have the sole power of impeachment, and that the President shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Further, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution prohibits any person who has engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the United States from holding any office under the United States. In his conduct while President of the United States and in violation of his constitutional oath, faithfully to execute the office of the President of the United States and, to the best of his ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, Donald John Trump engaged in high crimes and misdemeanors by inciting violence against the government of the United States in that, on January 6, 2021, pursuant to the 12th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, the Vice President of the United States, the House of Representatives, and the Senate met at the United States Capitol for a joint session of Congress to count the votes of the Electoral College. In the months preceding the joint session, President Trump repeatedly issued false statements asserting that the presidential election results were the product of widespread fraud and should not be accepted by the American people or certified by state or federal officials. Shortly before the joint session commenced, President Trump addressed a crowd at the Ellipse in Washington, D.C. There he reiterated false claims that we won this election and we won it by a landslide. He also willfully made statements that in context encouraged and foreseeably resulted in lawless action at the Capitol, such as, if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. Thus incited by President Trump, members of the crowd he had addressed in an attempt to, among other objectives, interfere with the joint session's solemn constitutional duty to certify the results of the 2020 presidential election, unlawfully breached and vandalized the Capitol, injured and killed law enforcement personnel, menaced members of Congress, the Vice President, and congressional personnel, and engaged in other violent, deadly, destructive, and seditious acts. President Trump's conduct on January 6, 2021, followed his prior efforts to subvert and obstruct the certification of the results of the 2020 presidential election. Those prior efforts included a phone call on January 2, 2021, during which President Trump urged the Secretary of State of Georgia, Brad Raffensperger, to find enough votes to overturn the Georgia presidential election results and threatened security Raffensperger if he failed to do so. In all this, President Trump gravely endangered the security of the United States and its institutions of government. He threatened the integrity of the democratic system, interfered with the peaceful transition of power, and imperiled a co-equal branch of government. He therefore betrayed his trust as president to the manifest injury of the people of the United States. Wherefore, Donald John Trump, by such conduct has demonstrated that he will remain a threat to national security, democracy, and the Constitution if allowed to remain in office, and has acted in a manner grossly incompatible with self-government and the rule of law. Donald John Trump thus warrants impeachment and trial, removal from office, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States, and demand that you, the said Donald John Trump, should be put to answer the accusations as set forth in this article, and that such proceedings, examinations, trials, and judgments might be thereupon had as are agreeable to law and justice.
Each senator, when his or her name is called, will stand in his or her place, and they'll vote guilty or not guilty as required by Rule 23 of the Senate Rules of Impeachment. Article 1, Section 3, Clause 6 of the Constitution, regarding the vote required for conviction on impeachment, provides that, quote, no person shall be convicted without the concurrence of 2/3 of the members present, close quote. The question is on the article of impeachment. Senators, how say you? Is the respondent Donald John Trump guilty or not guilty? A roll call vote is required, and the clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, guilty. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, not guilty. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, guilty. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, not guilty. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, guilty. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, not guilty. Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker, guilty. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, not guilty. Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun, not guilty. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, guilty. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, guilty. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, guilty. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, not guilty. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, guilty. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, guilty. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, guilty. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, guilty. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, guilty. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, guilty. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, not guilty. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, guilty. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Cotton, not guilty. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer, not guilty. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, not guilty. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, not guilty. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines, not guilty. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, guilty. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, guilty. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, not guilty. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, guilty. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, not guilty. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, guilty. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, not guilty. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, not guilty. Mr. Haggerty. Mr. Haggerty, not guilty. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan, guilty. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Hawley, not guilty. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, guilty. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Hickenlooper, guilty. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, guilty. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, not guilty. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, not guilty. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, not guilty. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson, not guilty. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane, guilty. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, guilty. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy, not guilty. Mr. King. Mr. King, guilty. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, guilty. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford, not guilty. Mr. Leahy.
Guilty.
Mr. Leahy, guilty. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, not guilty. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan, guilty. Ms. Lummis. Ms. Lummis, not guilty. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, guilty. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, guilty. Mr. Marshall. Mr. Marshall, not guilty. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, not guilty. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, guilty. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, guilty. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, not guilty. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, guilty. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, guilty. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, guilty. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Ossoff, guilty. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Padilla, guilty. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, not guilty. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, guilty. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, not guilty. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, guilty. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, not guilty. Mr. Romney. Mr. Romney, guilty. Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen, guilty. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rounds, not guilty. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, not guilty. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, guilty. Mr. Sass. Mr. Sass, guilty. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, guilty. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, guilty. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of Florida, not guilty. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, not guilty. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, guilty. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, not guilty. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Sinema, guilty. Ms. Smith. Ms. Smith, guilty. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, guilty. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, not guilty. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, guilty. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, not guilty. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, not guilty. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, guilty. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Tuberville, not guilty. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, guilty. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, guilty. Mr. Warnock. Mr. Warnock, guilty. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, guilty. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, guilty. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, not guilty. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, guilty. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, not guilty. Why we have these things? Unless you had a script.
The yeas are 57. The nays are 43. Two-thirds of the senators present not having voted guilty. The Senate judges that the respondent, Donald John Trump, former President of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the article of impeachment. Presiding officer directs judgment to be entered in accordance with the judgment of the Senate as follows. The Senate, having tried Donald John Trump, former President of the United States, upon one article of impeachment exhibited against him by the House of Representatives, and two-thirds of the senators present not having found him guilty of the charge contained therein, it is therefore ordered and adjudged that the said Donald John Trump be, and he is hereby acquitted of the charge in said article.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader is recognized.
Mr. President, I send an order to the desk.
And the clerk will report.
Ordered that the Secretary be directed to communicate to the Secretary of State as provided by Rule 23 of the Rules of Procedure and Practice in the Senate when sitting on impeachment trials, and also to the House of Representatives the judgment of the Senate in the case of Donald John Trump, and transmit a certified copy of the judgment to each.
Without objection, the order will be entered. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I move that the Senate, sitting as a court of impeachment on the article against Donald John Trump, adjourn sine die.
And without objection, the motion is agreed to. The Senate, sitting as a court of impeachment, stands adjourned sine die. And could I have order, please? The presiding officer, the acting sergeant at arms will escort the House managers out of the Senate chamber. In order.
President. Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, can we have order?
The Senate is not in order, and the Senate will be in order.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate be in a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection, so ordered. Does any senator seek recognition? Senator from New York, Majority Leader.
Mr. President, the case of Donald Trump's second impeachment trial was open. Mr. President, can we have order, please?
The senator is right. The Senate is not in order. Senate will be in order. Senate will be in order. Please take your conversations off the floor.
Thank you, Mr.
Senator
President.
from New York.
The case of Donald Trump's second impeachment trial was open and shut. President Trump told a lie, a big lie, that the election was stolen and that he was the rightful winner. He laid the groundwork for this big lie in the months before the election. He told the big lie on election night, and he repeated the big lie more than 100 times in the weeks afterwards. He summoned his supporters to Washington, assembled them on the ellipse, whipped them into a frenzy, and directed them at the Capitol. And then he watched as the violence unfolded and the Capitol was breached. And his own vice president fled for his life, and President Trump did nothing. None of these facts were up for debate. We saw it, we heard it, we lived it. This was the first presidential impeachment trial in history in which all senators were not only judges and jurors, but witnesses to the constitutional crime that was committed. The former president inspired, directed, and propelled a mob to violently prevent the peaceful transfer of power, subvert the will of the people, and illegally keep that president in power. There is nothing more un-American than that. There is nothing more antithetical to our democracy. There is nothing more insulting to the generations of American patriots who gave their lives to defend our form of government. This was the most egregious violation of the presidential oath of office and a textbook example, a classic example of an impeachable offense worthy of the Constitution's most severe remedy. In response to the incontrovertible fact of Donald Trump's guilt, the Senate was subject to a feeble and sometimes incomprehensible defense of the former president. Unable to dispute the case on the merits, the former president's counsel treated us to partisan vitriol, false equivalence, and outright falsehoods. We heard the roundly debunked jurisdictional argument that the Senate cannot try a former official, a position that would mean that any president could simply resign to avoid accountability for an impeachable offense, a position which in effect would render the Senate powerless to ever enforce the disqualification clause in the Constitution. Essentially, the President's counsel told the Senate that the Constitution was unconstitutional. Thankfully, the Senate took a firm stance, set a firm precedent with a bipartisan vote in favor of our power to try former officials for acts they committed while in office. We heard the preposterous claim that the former president's incitement to violence was protected by the First Amendment. The First Amendment right to free speech protects Americans from jail, not presidents from impeachment. If the president had said during World War II that, quote, Germany should attack the United States on Long Island, we've left it undefended, I suspect Congress would have considered that an impeachable offense. Finally, the defense counsel said that President Trump was not directly responsible for the violence at the Capitol. Quote, his words were merely a metaphor, his directions were merely suggestions, and the violent mob was just a spontaneous demonstration. But wind the clock back and ask yourself, if at any point Donald Trump did not do the things he did, would the attack on the Capitol have happened? There's only one answer to this question. Of course not. If President Trump hadn't told his supporters to march to the Capitol, if he hadn't implored them to come to Washington on January 6th in the first place, if he hadn't repeatedly lied to them that the election was stolen, their country was being taken from them, the attack would not have happened, could not have happened. January 6th would not have happened but for the actions of Donald Trump. Here's what the Republican leader of the Senate said. The mob that perpetrated the, quote, failed insurrection, unquote, was on January 6th was, quote, provoked by President Trump. You want another word for provoke? How about incite? Yet still, the vast majority of the Senate Republican caucus, including the Republican leader, voted to acquit former President Trump, signing their names in the columns of history alongside his name forever. January 6th will live as a day of infamy in the history of the United States of America. The failure to convict Donald Trump will live as a vote of infamy in the history of the United States Senate. 5 years ago, Republican senators lamented what might become of their party if Donald Trump became their presidential nominee and standard-bearer. Just look at what has happened. Look at what Republicans have been forced to defend. Look at what Republicans have chosen to forgive. The former president tried to overturn the results of a legitimate election and provoked an assault on our own government. And well over half the Senate Republican conference decided to condone it. The most despicable act that any president has ever committed, and the majority of Republicans cannot summon the courage or the morality to condemn it. This trial wasn't about choosing country over party, even not that. This was about choosing country over Donald Trump. And 43 Republican members chose Trump. They chose Trump. It should be a weight on their conscience today, and it shall be a weight on their conscience in the future. As sad as that fact is, as condemnable as the decision was, it is still true that the final vote on Donald Trump's conviction was the largest and most bipartisan vote of any presidential impeachment trial in American history. I salute those Republican patriots who did the right thing. It wasn't easy. We know that. Let their votes be a message to the American people. Because, my fellow Americans, if this nation is going to long endure, we as a people cannot sanction the former president's Congress. Because if lying about the results of an election is acceptable, if instigating a mob against the government is considered permissible, if encouraging political violence becomes the norm, it will be open season on our democracy. And everything will be up for grabs by whoever has the biggest clubs, the sharpest spears, the most powerful guns. By not recognizing the heinous crime that Donald Trump committed against the Constitution, Republican senators have not only risked, but potentially invited the same danger that was just visited upon us. So let me say this. Despite the results of the vote on Donald Trump's conviction in the court of impeachment, he deserves to be convicted, and I believe he will be convicted in the court of public opinion. He deserves to be permanently discredited, and I believe he has been discredited in the eyes of the American people and in the judgment of history. Even though Republican senators prevented the Senate from disqualifying Donald Trump for any office of honor, trust, or profit under these United States, there is no question Donald Trump has disqualified himself. I hope, I pray, and I believe that the American people will make sure of that. And if Donald Trump ever stands for public office again, and after everything we have seen this week, I hope, I pray, and I believe that he will meet the unambiguous rejection by the American people. 6 hours after the attack on January 6th, after the carnage and mayhem was shown on every television screen in America, President Trump told his supporters to, quote, "Remember this day forever." I ask the American people to heed his words. Remember that day forever, but not for the reasons the former president intended. Remember the panic in the voices over the radio dispatch, the rhythmic pounding of fists and flags at the chamber doors. Remember the crack of a solitary gunshot. Remember the hateful and racist Confederate flags flying through the halls of our Union. Remember the screams of the bloody officer crushed between the onrushing mob and a doorway to the Capitol, his body trapped in the breach. Remember the 3 Capitol police officers who lost their lives. Remember that those rioters actually succeeded in delaying Congress from certifying the election. Remember how close our democracy came to ruin. My fellow Americans, remember that day, January 6th, forever. The final terrible legacy of the 45th President of the United States, and undoubtedly our worst. Let it live on in infamy, a stain on Donald John Trump that can never, never be washed away. Mr. President, on Monday, we'll recognize President's Day. Part of the commemoration in the Senate will be the annual reading of Washington's farewell address. Aside from winning the Revolutionary War, I consider it his greatest contribution to American civil life. And it had nothing to do with the words he spoke, but the example it set. Washington's farewell address established for all time that no one had the right to the office of the presidency, that it belonged to the people. What an amazing legacy. What an amazing gift to the future generations. The knowledge that this country will always be greater than any one person, even our most renowned. That's why members of both parties take turns reading Washington's address once a year in full into the record, to pledge common attachment to the selflessness at the core of our democratic system. This trial was about the final acts of a president who represents the very antithesis of our first president and sought to place one man before the entire country, himself. Let the record show, before God, history, and the solemn oath we swear to the Constitution, that there was only one correct verdict in this trial, guilty. And I pray that while justice was not done in this trial, it will be carried forward by the American people who, above any of us in this chamber, determine the destiny of our great nation. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Republican leader.
January 6th was a disgrace. American citizens attacked their own government. They used terrorism to try to stop a specific piece of domestic business they did not like. Fellow Americans beat and bloodied our own police. They stormed the Senate floor. They tried to hunt down the Speaker of the House. They built a gallows and chanted about murdering the Vice President. They did this because they'd been fed wild falsehoods by the most powerful man on earth. Because he was angry he'd lost an election. Former President Trump's actions preceded the riot were a disgraceful dereliction of duty. The House accused the former president of, quote, incitement. That is a specific term from the criminal law. Let me just put that aside for a moment and reiterate something I said weeks ago. There's no question, none, that President Trump is practically and morally responsible for provoking the events of the day. No question about it. The people who stormed this building believed they were acting on the wishes and instructions of their president. And having that belief was a foreseeable consequence of the growing crescendo of false statements, conspiracy theories, and reckless hyperbole, which the defeated president kept shouting into the largest megaphone on planet Earth. The issue is not only the president's intemperate language on January 6th. It is not just his endorsement of remarks in which an associate urged, quote, trial by combat. It was also the entire manufactured atmosphere of looming catastrophe, the increasingly wild myths about a reverse landslide election that was somehow being stolen, some secret coup by our now president. Now, I defended the president's right to bring any complaints to our legal system. The legal system spoke. The Electoral College spoke. As I stood up and said clearly at that time, the election was settled. It was over. But that just really opened a new chapter of even wilder, and more unfounded claims. The leader of the free world cannot spend weeks thundering that shadowy forces are stealing our country and then feign surprise when people believe him and do reckless things. Now, sadly, many politicians sometimes make overheated comments or use metaphors. We saw that unhinged listeners might take literally, but that was different. That's different from what we saw. This was an intensifying crescendo of conspiracy theories orchestrated by an outgoing president who seemed determined to either overturn the voters' decision or else torch our institutions on the way out. The unconscionable behavior did not end when the violence actually began. Whatever our ex-president claims he thought might happen that day, whatever reaction he says he meant to produce, by that afternoon, we know he was watching the same live television as the rest of us. A mob was assaulting the Capitol in his name. These criminals were carrying his banners, hanging his flags, and screaming their loyalty to him. It was obvious that only President Trump could end this. He was the only one who could. Former aides publicly begged him to do so. Loyal allies frantically called the administration. The president did not act swiftly. He did not do his job. He didn't take steps so federal law could be faithfully executed and order restored. No. Instead, according to public reports, he watched television happily, as the chaos unfolded. Kept pressing his scheme to overturn the election. Now, even after it was clear to any reasonable observer that Vice President Pence was in serious danger, even as the mob, carrying Trump banners, beating cops, and breaching perimeters, the president sent a further tweet attacking his own vice president. Now, predictably and foreseeably under the circumstances, members of the mob seem to interpret this as a further inspiration to lawlessness and violence, not surprisingly. Later, even when the president did half-heartedly begin calling for peace, he didn't call right away for the riot to end. He did not tell the mob to depart until even later. And even then, with police officers bleeding and broken glass covering Capitol floors, he kept repeating election lies and praising the criminals. In recent weeks, our ex-president's associates have tried to use the 74 million Americans who voted to re-elect him as a kind of human shield against criticism. Using the 74 million who voted for him as a kind of a human shield against criticism. Anyone who decries his awful behavior is accused of insulting millions of voters. That's an absurd deflection. 74 million Americans did not invade the Capitol. Hundreds of rioters did. 74 million Americans did not engineer the campaign of disinformation and rage that provoked it. One person did. Just one. Now, I've made my view of this episode very plain. But our system of government gave the Senate a specific task. The Constitution gives us a particular role. This body is not invited to act as the nation's overarching moral tribunal. We're not free to work backward from whether the accused party might personally deserve some kind of punishment. Justice Joseph Story, our nation's first great constitutional scholar, as he explained nearly 200 years ago, the process of impeachment and conviction is a narrow tool for a narrow purpose. Story explained this limited tool exists to, quote, secure the state against gross official misdemeanors, end quote. That is, to protect the country from government officers. If President Trump were still in office, I would have carefully considered whether the House managers proved their specific charge. By the strict criminal standard, the president's speech probably was not incitement. However, in the context of impeachment, the Senate might have decided this was acceptable shorthand for the reckless actions that preceded the riot. But in this case, the question is moot because former President Trump is constitutionally not eligible for conviction. Now, this is a close question, no doubt. Donald Trump was the president when the House voted, though not when the House chose to deliver the papers. Brilliant scholars argue both sides of this jurisdictional question. The text is legitimately ambiguous. I respect my colleagues who've reached either conclusion. But after intense reflection, I believe the best constitutional reading shows that Article 2, Section 4 exhausts the set of persons who can legitimately be impeached, tried, or convicted. It's the president, it's the vice president, and civil officers. We have no power to convict and disqualify a former office holder who is now a private citizen. Here is Article 2, Section 4. Quote, the president, the vice president, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, end quote. Now, everyone basically agrees that the second half of that sentence exhausts the legitimate grounds for conviction. The debates around the Constitution's framing make that abundantly clear. Congress cannot convict for reasons besides those. It therefore follows that the list of persons in that same sentence is also exhaustive. There's no reason why one list would be exhaustive, but the other would not. Article 2, Section 4 must limit both why impeachment and conviction can occur and to whom. And to whom. If this provision does not limit impeachment and conviction powers, then it has no limits at all. The House has sole power of impeachment, and the Senate's sole power to try all impeachments would create an unlimited circular logic empowering Congress to ban any private citizen from federal office. Now, that's an incredible claim. But it's the argument that the House managers seem to be making. One manager said the House and Senate have, quote, absolute, unqualified jurisdictional power, end quote. Well, that was very honest, because there is no limiting principle in the constitutional text that would empower the Senate to convict former officers that would not also let them convict and disqualify any private citizen. An absurd end result to which no one subscribes. Article 2, Section 4 must have force. It tells us the president, vice president, and civil officers may be impeached and convicted. Donald Trump's no longer the president. Likewise, the provision states that officers subject to impeachment and conviction shall be removed from office if convicted. Shall be removed from office if convicted. As Justice Story explained, the Senate, upon conviction, is bound in all cases to enter a judgment of removal from office. Removal is mandatory upon conviction. Clearly, he explained, that mandatory sentence cannot be applied to someone who's left office. The entire process revolves around removal. If removal becomes impossible, conviction becomes insensible. In one light, it certainly does seem counterintuitive that an office holder can elude Senate conviction by resignation or expiration of term, an argument we heard made by the managers. But this underscores that impeachment was never meant to be the final forum for American justice. Never meant to be the final forum for American justice. Impeachment, conviction, and removal are a specific intra-governmental safety valve. It is not the criminal justice system where individual accountability is the paramount goal. Indeed, Justice Story specifically reminded that while former officials were not eligible for impeachment or conviction, they were, and this is extremely important, still liable to be tried and punished in the ordinary tribunals of justice. Put another way, in the language of today, President Trump is still liable for everything he did while he was in office as an ordinary citizen. Unless the statute of limitations is run, still liable for everything he did while he's in office. Didn't get away with anything yet. Yet. We have a criminal justice system in this country. We have civil litigation. And former presidents are not immune from being accountable by either one. I believe the Senate was right not to grab power the Constitution doesn't give us. And the Senate was right not to entertain some light-speed sham process to try to outrun the loss of jurisdiction. It took both sides more than a week just to produce their pretrial briefs. Speaker Pelosi's own scheduling decisions conceded what President Biden publicly confirmed: a Senate verdict before Inauguration Day was never possible. Now, Mr. President, this has been a dispiriting time. But the Senate has done our duty. The framers' firewall held up again. On January the 6th, we returned to our posts and certified the election. We were uncowed. We were not intimidated. We finished the job. And since then, we resisted the clamor to defy our own constitutional guardrails in hot pursuit of a particular outcome. We refused to continue a cycle of recklessness by straining our own constitutional boundaries in response. The Senate's decision today does not condone anything that happened on or before that terrible day. It simply shows that senators did what the former president failed to do. We put our constitutional duty first.
President. The senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. President. I take this time to explain why I voted to convict the former President of the United States, Donald Trump, of the articles of impeachment presented by the House of Representatives in regards to the incitement